then, like I said, we may start what I call part 2, which is actually the biosynthesis of amino acids. But if not, well, regardless, even if we don't, I just put on chapter 22. Hopefully, I added to the right chapter on my fire. I was in a hurry trying to do it. The PowerPoint, technically it's a PDF. It's got the boxes to where that way you can follow along with it. Because there are lots of enzymes. And once again, as long as you know your enzyme classifications and names, that does a lot. And then sometimes there's some like dinitrogenase, that may not be as obvious, but dinitrogenase reductase, which is a part of it, should be. So here we were talking about nitrogen fixation. So how ultimately our goal is to get nitrogens in order to build things. And so we talked about the flow of electrons from how certain organisms can use it from pyruvate, or at least from something that initially donated the electrons. Not ultimately, but they go to dinitrogenase reductase, which gets oxidized. In the process of losing its electrons, it's going to add them to dinitrogenase. And dinitrogenase is actually the enzyme that will take atmospheric nitrogen, which is inert, and convert it and make it to ammonia. Now, one thing that's a little different about this is the fact that, it does contain iron, but it's the fact that it uses molybdenum. Okay? It's got 2 molybdenum, 32 iron, 30 sulfurs, which we've seen these iron and sulfur centers in electron transport chain, and it's very similar to that. And I just wanted to, and there are some forms in certain bacteria that actually use vanadium instead of molybdenum. But it's really cool that these are, other elements and metals that are used that you may not think about that are very important. This is just to show a picture. I'm just going to go quickly over this just to show you the fact that we can have these super complexes. And I'm going to actually start on the outside, right? The outside, in the sense that these are the reductases, the dinitrogenase reductases, which are directly adjacent to the actually dinitrogenases, which would be ultimately where the fixation of nitrogen would occur. But if we peel all that back, you can actually see the other compounds. And here's just an example of the iron along with the molybdenum. And so we can see where the electrons ultimately would get passed off and then ultimately to nitrogen. Okay. This is just a blow up of it to show that it's very complex. I would never ask you to identify this or to draw it or anything, but just to know that molybdenum is used. Like you said, there's at least one, if not more, organisms that can actually even use vanadium instead of molybdenum, but molybdenum is used. Okay. This is where I really want to start focusing on now, is the fact that how do we get ammonia, which is normally toxic, right? And how do we start to incorporate ammonia into the biomolecules? And so what are some of the possible amino acids that can be used? We think about it. What's a good amino acid? If we think about how we got rid of nitrogen, what are some of those amino acids that we use to get rid of nitrogen? Alanine, glutamine, and what's another one that's well, it is aspartate, but I was going to say glutamate, okay, right? Because they're very similar in that sense. And lo and behold, it's glutamine. Okay, those are the biggies. That most organisms are going to utilize glutamine in order to sequester that ammonia. Okay, and that way we can utilize that ammonia to make something else. And so most organisms are going to have an enzyme that's going to take here's ammonium, but would take what would be ammonia to make glutamine. Oh, I don't want to paste anything. Okay. So let's look at that. Okay. So here we go. It's a 2-step process. So it's not direct for us. All organisms have this enzyme. You can take the glutamate, we have to activate it, which we've seen that kind of thing before. And we're activating, it says gamma glutamyl phosphate. What does that gamma mean? Is it what? Right, so it's not, normally we talk about alpha amino acids. And this is actually very similar to what we were discussing just in history of cancer. Here, what's going to be phosphorylated on the glutamate is not because technically there are two spots, right? We have two carboxylic acids. There's the one that's the alpha carboxylic acid, and then there's the one that's going to be at the gamma position, the one that's on its R side group, R side chain, which makes sense that it's the one that's being activated because the carboxylate by itself is already happy, right? As a carboxylate, it's got resonance. Why would it want to have a nitrogen added to it, which would actually have less resonance? And that's also the position where the nitrogen needs to be added. By putting a phosphate there first, phosphate is a great leaving group. And so that's why it's going to look something like this as an intermediate, which let me, come on now, I want to make it fatter. So I'm just going to draw the carboxylic acid portion. Remember, this is the terminal one. So now, and I'll draw the phosphate all the way out. So it's negatively charged, negatively charged. There's lots of resonance there, but we can see now we can have the nitrogen from the amino group coming in, smacking that ground zero carbon, forming your tetrahedral intermediate. You can collapse the tetrahedral intermediate and popping off that phosphate. And in doing so, we went from what originally was the glutamate with the carboxylic acid, ultimately, whoop, that's supposed to be an arrow, ultimately to make the glutamine. So that's how we can actually first get that nitrogen in there. Okay, so if we're going to name this, what class or classes of enzymes could this possibly be? It's a two-step process, but it's one enzyme that does it. The first step is phosphorylation using this ATP. The second step is actually the addition of the nitrogen group. So what are the possible classes of enzymes this could be? Pardon? A kinase or? Someone said that, I think. Just say it with conviction. Synthetase. So which one would it make sense on this one? Which one makes more sense? Is this a kinase or is it a synthetase? Synthetase, because we are building something ultimately. Kinases a lot of times are just for the phosphorylation event, and then that's the end product in and of itself. Here we're building something, and we have to have that energy, that energetic intermediate. So if we're going to name, now we know it's a synthetase, so specifically what kind of synthetase is this one? Right, so if you're making glutamine, it would be, see, that's, the old G.I. Joes used to say, knowing is half the battle. Yo, Joe. Once again, knowing is half the battle. And so, yeah, that's this glutamine synthetase. Now, it should be noted, this is just a little point of notification. Remember, all organisms can do this, including us. But there are organisms that can make and utilize glutamine and glutamate without utilizing the ATP, okay? And so that's just this is a little side note. There are plants and bacteria that can do it using glutamate synthase. So that's why it's really important that you put the synthetase, because we require ATP. They get around it in the sense that they can technically use alpha ketoglutarate and not even use an aminotransferase. So now we can actually go through alpha ketoglutarate, glutamate, not have an aminotransfer, plants and bacteria. And so, but once again, this is just, it's really important that you know that's a synthetase for us, whereas some plants and bacteria can actually synthesize glutamate and glutamine using glutamate synthase and alpha ketoglutarate. Okay. Now, the glutamine synthetase looks like that was really simple. Of course, it looks really, the naming is simple. Of course, it's much more complicated than that in the sense of how it's regulated. This is a major regulatory process here. So those who have had, and I don't know if they cover, in neuroscience, you guys covered glutamate and glutamine very much? Okay. And so, and in chemistry of cancer, I mean, we're currently talking about it a lot. These are major biomolecules. So they're utilized for a lot of things, and they can also dictate the health of a cell, okay? If your glutamate gets too high, which glutamate is also a neurotransmitter, it will kill the cell too high extracellularly. It's just one of the signs that cell needs to die, okay? And so you have to have a fine control over this. Plus, we already know that glutamine is one of the two major amino acids in the blood because it's for nitrogen trafficking, right? And so we have to have a fine way to tune this and to control this. And so it has both covalent modification, which I'll show you a picture. Remember, that means something is physically attached to it. Usually, we were talking about phosphorylation. Here it's not just phosphorylation, there are I can think of at least two other things that can be added on. And allosteric. There are eight different things that combine and cause allosteric here. And so I really like to pick, this is really a great example of it not being like the light switch that goes on and off, but being that fine-tuned dial, where you can have very, 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 very fine-tuned control over the amount of glutamine and glutamate that you have around. So once again, if they go askew, if they get out of whack, then bad things can happen. And they're also used for a whole host of things. Okay. So, the technical term is additive, to where if all 8 are, then it's effectively shut off. That's my little, I always like to use that example. Maybe I was just a simple child. But I had two grandparents. We have two sets of grandparents. My native Ozark grandparents, they had, just their bathroom just had a regular light switch. But whenever we go to Indianapolis, my Hebraic grandparents, they had the dial, which I just was fascinated. Plus, my grandmother always would leave it at night, just barely on, with that glow through the house in order for you to do it. So this is the way that enzyme works, is that you can have it where it's barely a glow, all the way on, all the way off, depending upon whether or not how many of these effectors are attached. This is one picture. Some of these make sense. Some of them won't make sense right now. This is just the allosteric regulation. Of course, we can see it's huge, which you can imagine. In order for it to have 8 binding sites, in addition to at least 2 or 3 covalent modification sites, it's a massive complex. And so once again, the goals go from glutamate to glutamine. Glutamine, which we haven't discovered or learned about this yet. Obviously, glutamine, actually, I shouldn't even say obvious because we haven't covered any of these yet. But glutamine is involved in the synthesis of some of the nucleotides, other amino acids, and then carbamoyl phosphate. Where did we see carbamoyl phosphate? We have seen that one. That's the urea cycle. And then, of course, glucosamine. And so we can see any time that any of their metabolites, you get too much of it, it's going to come up here and help turn it off. Okay. Plus, another way to think about it is if there's a lot of carbamoyl phosphate, then that means that the urea cycle is backed up and we're trying to get rid of nitrogen anyway. We don't need to be building it into our system as well. Some of the other two, glycine and alanine, and technically those are not derivatives. But anytime that we have too much of that around, that's indicative that we've got our nitrogen fixation. We have plenty of nitrogen in our system. Okay. The next figure is the one I would usually want to spend a little bit more time on because it's about the covalent. Remember, this is allosteric. This is a covalent. This one, first of all, people usually make fun of me because I have problems saying a lot of these terms, which is perfectly fine to make fun of it. But this one, really, you have to take some time to digest it. I would never ask you to draw this. I promise you I will not ask you to draw it. I could see giving you something like this and having you explain one part or having you explain parts of it. Because it is not easy. At least it wasn't for me. Maybe it's one of your giftings to where the gifting of the Holy Spirit. You can understand these metabolic pathway charts a lot easier. Okay, I don't know where to start. Well, we're going to start off with here. The enzyme itself has an amino acid that can be covalently modified. What amino acid was this originally? Tyrosine. Okay, because see, this would be the benzene ring. That would be the alcohol that can go on to be a nucleophile for various things. And so this is just showing you. Does anyone know what is this right here? What is all of this? It's drawn out. But what would it look like down here? Like, how can we abbreviate this rather than have to draw this out every time? This is AMP, because it's the A, and it's a monophosphate. So it's where I'm going to call it ampylation, okay, or amped, because I don't want to have to keep saying adenosine monophosphorylation, okay? So it's amped or ampylated. Right. So this is the enzyme that we've been talking about. Remember, there are already 8 places on it that can have allosteric effectors. Now we're talking about the covalent ones. Another protein that I want to point out is this P2. This P with the subscript of Roman numeral 2. It's also a regulatory protein. All right, so where should we start? Where? Of course, this enzyme, when it's active, takes glutamate, makes glutamine. It does require ATP. Okay, now, so to go from the active, or to activate it, let's activate it first. It's inactive whenever it's been amped. Okay, so the process here is called de-adenylation. These get to be a tongue twister. It's been deamped. Okay, it's been de-adenylated. Okay, the way it gets deamped is that it's an inorganic phosphate that comes in and smacks and kicks off that ADP, or it comes in and kicks off as an ADP, I should say. All right, so the enzyme that does this process is this AT, which is an adenylyl transferase. This adenylyl transferase is upregulated for it whenever the P2 protein is umpylated. Okay, is umped. So when there's a UMP attached to the P2 protein, it's going to activate the AT, which will activate this entire process. Okay, so now let's focus on P2, because P2 has 2 different possibilities. It can be umped, uridylated, or it can be dumped. I like that one better, dumped. Okay, whenever it doesn't have the UMP on it, and it binds to the ATP, it actually does the opposite process here for the adenylyl transferase. And so therefore, it's going to adenylate it, and it's amped. So now we have to regulate P2. And P2 is regulated versus uridylation. Okay, so the enzyme that does that's called uridylyl transferase. See, it's a mouthful. Which all that means is it takes a UTP and it adds on a UMP, right? And so whenever this enzyme gets activated, it's going to take the P2 and ump it, which will then ultimately activate the glutamine synthetase. Whatever helps you remember it. If you want to say ump and dump, then feel free to do so. All right, so what are some of the activators for this, or inhibitors for this? If there's lots of inorganic phosphate, it's going to turn it off. If there's a lot of glutamine, it's going to turn it off, which should make sense. This one's not as obvious, but it should make sense that a lot of glutamine, because that means you no longer need to make more glutamine. Okay, likewise, things that turn this whole process on is if we have a lot of alpha-ketoglutarate, will turn this process on. And we'll turn this process off, alpha-ketoglutarate and ATP, because if we have a lot of ATP, it's going to force it to go this direction. So that's why it takes a little bit of time to set through and just try to figure it out. And you may want to just kind of chew it over, like just look at it, and once again, if it helps you say ump and dump and amp and damp or whatever, then feel free. But it's the same proteins involved, but it just matters on whether or not how they've been covalently modified. That's a mouthful. Whew. Okay, so now as a segue into really the rest of this chapter, is that there are different classifications of reactions that are occurring. Some of these we've seen, the transamination or the amino acid transferase kind of reactions, and rearrangements that use PLP. We've seen that before. Okay, that's like, remember all of the aminotransferases use what amino acid? Glutamate. Okay, and then they're always named for what the other amino acid product is. Okay, then we have, so that one's nothing new. Then we have 1 carbon transfers. which we haven't, I don't know that we've seen this yet, or in any great detail, but we can actually transfer methyl. These are like methyl transferases, okay? And so that's really important, sort of like building blocks, like to try to build up like a Lincoln log cabin or Legos or whatever. But obviously in vivo, we're limited. In vitro, in organic chemistry, you learn about different ways with, activating things with halogens and free radicalization and stuff. All that wouldn't be wise in vivo, right? Because we would die, which would be bad. So we utilize tetrahydrofolate or S-adenosylmethionine, which S-adenosylmethionine actually has two nicknames. One is SAM, S-A-M, SAM. Does anyone know what the other nickname is? To me, it sounds like something from Star Wars, and I'm not even a sci-fi fan, but it's Adomet. Doesn't it sound like a sci-fi name, like a Adomet from the planet, whatever, Zoltrar, or what have you. But yeah, it's Adomet for adenylylated methionine. And the S just lets you know that it's adenylated to disulfur methionine. But those are what's used in order to ultimately transfer methyl groups. Amino transfer reactions also from an amide, which is a little different than what we've seen in the past. Okay. So we're going to go into greater detail right now on this one right here. We've already seen this one, and then we'll talk about that probably not until Friday. Well, actually, I know it's not until Friday. So the class of enzymes that utilize the amide nitrogen are called amidotransferases, and technically it's glutamine amidotransferase. Now you do it. Thank you. So this is actually where we're going to end off, because we only actually have a couple slides in this one. And then, so for the next class on Friday, we'll finish the last 2 slides of this, which is not available on my part yet, but you may want to bring in or have. Just trust me, the next section, there are lots of boxes where we put in enzyme names and stuff. So I'm going to hang out in class with prayer.